Oi, oi, you're right. It should come as some relief to you that I'm not doing a risible and probably very tasteless attempt at humour. I went on a bit of a weird tangent there, and it's not helpful, is it? So, apologies. One thing I've noticed when raising any doubts or concerns about Lucy Letby's conviction is the really popular riposte that she's had two trials. She had two trials to get to the truth, and it's delivered like a gotcha or such a persuasive slapdown that it casts doubters as scandalously obtuse and arrogant. Increasingly often, I see people decide that they are somehow representing the parents and that they are somehow being directly challenged and insulted, which I find really quite sinister and so patently manipulative. I'm not going to engage in that. But overall, there's a sense that you are being gratuitously offensive and just acting with incredible audacity to question what two juries or 24 jurors decided on, having seen all this evidence that they alone had access to, despite the fact that there has been an incredible torrent of information that has come out since, which obviously the jury never heard. So it is quite a problem, isn't it? And I think there's a perception that because this trial was so big and so high profile and so long, the behaviour of all involved was exemplary, and because obviously it was under scrutiny, and I really don't believe that was the case at all. Fundamentally, I think as a society, just generally, that we tend to forget a trial is a performance. It's about performances. It's a production, and in many ways, it kind of functions as a stage. And where the evidence is dense and dry and takes some real cognitive effort to absorb, there's a real danger, I think, that you get a persuasive, compelling, emotional testimony would provoke a much more powerful, visceral response from the jurors and stay in their memories much longer. And I hate to say it, but I will. Quite a lot of people are stupid. It's true. The stuff that I have heard from people who have served on juries is also pretty worrying, whether it be the prejudice, lack of interest, or just the stupidity. This case was going to really test anyone, especially with the duration and the level of emotion involved. And then you've got the things that happen, the problems with any juries, the confirmation bias, and what kind of relationship people build over 10 months. I mean, the conformity bias is going to be really powerful. So for one juror to have gone guilty on the first two and then not guilty, that really would have taken some strength of character and some principle, I would have thought. Either that or they're just a contrarian twat. But you've got to wonder, I can't help wonder about that juror all the time and what they would say about this. The amount of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that the jury or anyone doesn't know about is kind of overwhelming. You know, from the CPS and how they make their decisions to the agreed facts between parties, what the judge preconceived ideas are, if any, what prejudices they hold, what they are going to allow, and what they are going to rule inadmissible. Fairly critical. All of these pre-trial hearings where these details are thrashed out is all very relevant. And then there's the difficulty of getting defence witnesses, expert witnesses, where allegations of child abuse are at stake. Dr. Wayne Squires was struck off after countering prosecution evidence in shaken baby syndrome. And she's done a TED talk, multiple articles, maybe even a book, all focusing on the consequences for her career and her personal life, for everything, after having encountered what she considered to be pseudoscience. And all these things end up, they coalesce and turn into the trial where we're supposed to believe that this is a fact-finding mission, and it really is more of a performance from what I can gather. And the influence a biased judge can have just with one finger on the scale is mammoth. We have an adversarial justice system, and I think there are some real dangers to it. as well as having everything so tightly orchestrated. The whole thing with the legal system, by its very nature, it has to be carefully constructed around a set of rules and principles, etc. But it becomes just agonizingly frustrating. You see a case such as Letby's where there are such huge doubts and Shu Lee coming forward, and the response to that is, well, you didn't come forward at the time. That's it. Just dismissed. Not that this is a stunning intervention and needs to be heard, but no, over in Canada, well, it would have been Maya's job. He didn't call you at the time, so sorry, Lucy Letby, if your KC, your legal team made a mistake, that kind of sucks, but that's it. The fact the one surviving author of the only large investigation of what air embolism looks like in babies and was cited almost 30 times at the trial, has come forward and said, this is wrong, you've got it wrong. And furthermore, because I am so appalled at this, I have gathered a team of other expert neonatologists, and we have meticulously gone through the cases of these babies with access to all of the evidence, and we have found a load of suboptimal care and no reasons to suspect murder. But the courts are concerned. I mean, this is like something out of a Lifetime TV afternoon film. The woman sent to prison, and then the doctor who wrote that original paper has come out of retirement and then gone and testified at her hearing for an appeal. And it's still irrelevant. This is insane. So the most critical part here is following process and protocol and making sure that you've been treated just as unfairly as others, rather than the truth. The truth is almost irrelevant. And despite a founding principle of the legal system being that it is better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent suffers, we appear happy to leave this be. Because what constitutes new evidence, according to our law, is this hasn't met it. I mean, surely most people think this is new evidence. Or, essentially, is such a staggering refutation of what was put to court that it's just rubbished it all. The character, reliability and evidence of Dowie Evans couldn't be any more trashed. And the same goes for Sandy Bowen. I mean, some of the stuff she said was mental. Marnarides, he's another suspect one. And her exoneration, which will come, it needs to be entirely public. It really does. It really, really needs fully showing up, or she will never be safe anywhere in the world. She's been completely destroyed by this. Just unimaginable what this has done to her. It really is heartbreaking. Because when you now look at all of the things that have come out, for example, the fail rating in an immunoassay and the stuff that we know was going on with the testing equipment and the lab that now throws additional doubt onto those results. How Dowie Evans chopped and changed his diagnoses. How he did know Lucy Letby's names from the notes and decided she must have murdered a child with an act that started on one day and then changed it because she wasn't fucking there. The door swipe entry failure, which has shown up Ravi Jayaram to be a barefaced liar. The Pseudomonas that was colonising the taps. And despite Ravi Jayaram saying the police decided to investigate within 10 minutes, actually the doctors worked really hard behind the scenes to pique the police's interest. Since the media gag was lifted a year ago, there have been just countless numbers of exposés and leaks that have been so critical to understanding what actually happened here, and every time it's absorbed and respun by this machine that keeps her there. And that's been a really chilling thing to witness. The whole scale of it is monumental. It's difficult to comprehend, and certainly I don't have the emotional capacity particularly, but as well as I don't have the practical amount of time that I wish I could to invest in really looking at this case. And that is not because I would be the best person to do so, but because it just drives me up the wall. And I think if anyone has ever been subjected to gaslighting, it really triggers you, and this really triggers me. That's why the social media conversation gets to me so much. Luckily, among independent-minded people, Lucy Letby is getting a huge amount of support, and there have been a vast number of investigative journalists looking at her case, which is fantastic. And chief among them is Lucy de Oliveira, who deserves awards for her coverage. She really does. She has continually kept up the pressure on this. She's done unbelievable amounts of work, picked up on stories, particularly at a time when nobody else would have touched them with a barge pole. She's also faced a huge amount of abuse, which is tragically predictable with the people we're dealing with, but she has never bitten back. You know, she's an amazingly good person, and once Lucy is freed, well, she will certainly have played a large part of that, which is pretty significant considering, I mean, I hadn't heard of her before, and she's really done incredible stuff. So now, getting back to the often cited 2 juries, 2 trials strength of the case, I would imagine it's time to focus on Judge James Goss. Strikes me as quite a malevolent figure who, in presiding over the case, had his hand on the scale the whole time. In terms of what I think otherwise points to Judge Goss's extreme prejudice in trying Lucy Letby are, well, particularly what he ruled as admissible and what he did not. And this is just going to be a quick rundown of stuff that I will deal with in the future. So, for example, he allowed bad character evidence for Lucy Letby. This includes her notes written in an extreme state of distress, and also, as we now know, written, if not explicitly on the recommendation of a counsellor, certainly written after a GP and the occupational therapist had advised her to get her feelings out on paper. There was also with this a complete lack of acknowledgement of the contradictory things that she had written on the same note, such as, I haven't done anything wrong, victimisation, discrimination, all of that sort of stuff that I spoke about in a recent video, and so I'm not going to repeat. It was also put up as evidence against her without any input from a psychologist. Then there are the Facebook searches, and this has been it's fallen into almost a kind of folklore now that she searched up the parents thousands of times. That's not true. She searched up the parents a total of 31 times during a period where she had searched up people as random as other dancers in her salsa classes, it says here, colleagues, people who worked in the local shop, a total of 2,287 times. Now, I was attacked by a man many years ago. I think I've mentioned this, but in the lead up to that, it was only for a couple of weeks, but he stalked me. To call what she did stalking is, it really pisses me off. It's ludicrous and a massive insult. So, like, some people have been stalked for years upon years, and it is terrifying. So that's just another manipulation and lie, essentially, that for some reason this incredibly strong case needs. Now, that is not an exhaustive list, 2 things, but things that he did not allow. Chief among these is the grievance process that she took out sometime after she had been suspended. This is where she discussed having been bullied and gossiped about behind her back. Called Nurse Death, the Angel of Death, which is such a weird moniker. Ravi Jayaram was allegedly overheard calling her Nurse Death in the canteen. Dr. Chris Green said that he was disgusted by their behaviour and he felt it was likely they had lied. He had interviewed them, including an interview with Ravi Jayaram where Ravi explains that no, there was no evidence against Lucy, and really it was that he was concerned that she was traumatised by the number of deaths. However, while he didn't allow any of this to be heard, He did allow the jury to hear that she had filed for a grievance complaint, feeding into the narrative that she was constantly trying to deflect and manipulate. That's well over 18 months into his alleged whistleblowing. It just stinks. Goss also allowed into evidence all of those text messages, allowing her to be interrogated and humiliated with questions about whether she understood what going commando meant when it wasn't even words she had used. And as well as this, the jury never heard about the Royal College of Child and Paediatric Health's review of the hospital, which the hospital had arranged after Lucy Letby's suspension. That review was pretty damning, particularly regarding the fact that consultants did just 2 ward rounds a week, providing intensive care on this unit. There were concerns that incidents and accidents were not being reported, that there was a wastewater issue at the hospital, and Pseudomonas colonising the taps, was critical of the culture and how notes were being written up. Later, not contemporaneously, that there was a reluctance to involve doctors and nowhere near enough consultant cover for the neonatal, paediatric and maternity unit. Then think of all the other things that have come out during Thirlwell. You know, there have been a torrent of shocking pieces of information that have come out over the course of that inquiry that have very much served Lucy Letby's favour. Now, as I said, I wasn't intending on getting bogged down in these details, but just giving an overview. But 2 other things particularly I would like to mention. When Dowie Evans' testimony was brought into question by Myers, how essentially Judge Goss ruled that this lay jury were somehow in the best position themselves to judge his veracity, despite the almost unprecedented turn of events where Lord Justice Jackson had written to the court to say Dowie Evans is a massive liability. He makes shit up. He's hugely partisan and his report was worthless. I mean, that's just insane. And he still decided no to keep him on. Another time, Myers tried to introduce evidence by Dr. Hall, who was the defence's neonatal specialist, and he rejected it. So, as Stuart Gillam has pointed out, this is probably kind of integral to why Myers decided not to call Dr. Hall and just go for assassinating Dowie Evans' character and logic. Because, I mean, what else are you going to do when you've got a judge who's shown himself to be so thoroughly biased? And you can really pick up on the frustration of Myers at several points. I think Myers knew from the outset that he was facing a ridiculously uphill struggle with this judge. And then there is Judge Goss's refusal to take seriously a complaint that the jurors, or one in particular, had been overheard in a cafe saying they had already made up their mind. I'd have thought that's an absolute cardinal sin to just be talking about it outside of the court, let alone making statements like that. I mean, when it came up in the Court of Appeal, it says here, this is from The Guardian, it was later suggested that the complaint may have been made maliciously as the complainant was traced back to a cafe owner who had been in dispute with the juror's partner over a phone. Now, I mean, does that make sense to you? I mean, one, was this cafe owner, complainant, ever charged with trying to disrupt the jury process? And secondly, how did somebody who had bought an iPhone or sold an iPhone to somebody know that their partner was serving on this jury? How did they know that? Goss knew that Lucy Letby's mental state had been massively affected by everything leading up to the trial, and it was in fact briefly delayed because of the mix-up when she was moved jails just before the trial, where they allegedly forgot to bring her medication, which, according to Myers, had left her, quote, incoherent. She cannot speak properly. Now, Lucy Letby was allowed some accommodation for this. She was allowed to enter the dock before the rest of the courtroom filed in, etc. But he allowed questioning under cross-examination by Nick Johnson KC that even Judith Merritt, who has made no secret of her fully believing Lucy Letby's guilt and swallowing the whole narrative about she didn't cry enough, blah, blah, even she described it as brutal. You know, there are points that she was reduced to almost a blubbering wreck, and she says the prosecution team walk out looking triumphant. So there's that. There is also the fact that statisticians tried to approach the judge to say, you really need some experts advising on this because of the shift chart. And yes, it's very popular now to say this was not a case based on statistics, but statistics are mentioned in the first page of the prosecution's opening speech. Now, he was written to by the British Statistical Society. He ignored that. He then heard one way or another of Richard Gill. Richard Gill had approached the court to say he wanted to help because people's understanding of statistics generally are just woefully poor. And when you find out other things that had not been relayed to the court, like how there had been all these other deaths that weren't featured on the shift chart, that the doctors had been removed, you know, all of this kind of really sinister cooking of the books. It looks awful. Now, I don't think Richard Gill ever got an acknowledgement from Judge Goss, but Judge Goss did speak about him in court. And he heard about his blogging and that he threatened him with contempt of court. Luckily, Gill doesn't live in the UK. But I mean, what the fuck? This judge just rejected absolutely anything that could be seen as in Letby's favour, which, let's be honest, is a whole fucking lot of stuff. There was no psychologist input. There was no psychologist brought up on the stand. No conversation except by Letby herself of her PTSD diagnosis, reliance on antidepressants and sleeping tablets, or the effect this may have on her affect, her demeanour. He allowed anonymity orders for every single person who asked for one. And this really makes cross-examination very difficult. It absolutely hamstrings the press after the fact for finding out stuff that may be relevant. And just, I mean, it allows people to say things that possibly they wouldn't otherwise. You know, it's a shield, isn't it? I mean, if you think that the pervy doctor who was chatting her up relentlessly is some reliable arbiter of truth, then yeah, I've got one of those brilliant AI super realistic puppies to sell you. And the reason for that was just, oh, my kids might find out and they're studying. It's like, what the that's in it. Is that in the interest of justice, is it? Just ridiculous. As I say, the court never heard of the Pseudomonas. They never heard very much about some of the working issues or the harassment Lucy Letby had faced. They didn't find out about the numerous acts of medical malpractice or suboptimal care. There was no statistical oversight to help the jury understand what the probability of that shift chart was and an exclusion of factors that would have gone in her favour. He then, for some unknown reason, allowed releases to the press, particularly the notes and the shift chart, well before any conviction. Some of this stuff would be really difficult to find out, but it doesn't appear that any applications by the prosecution were rejected, and certainly it doesn't appear that any applications by the defence were accepted. And then there are wider issues, such as the number of Lucy Letby's colleagues who were warned by the NHS or their managers not to testify on her behalf, and the refusal to allow Dr. Hall to give a running commentary as to what he believed would be the more likely causes with each of these children, which means the trial opened in the beginning of October. It took until May before the defence began. By the end of July, the jury went out for deliberations, and really quickly they lost one member due to personal reasons, so it's 11 jurors by this stage. According to anecdotal reports, there were real issues as to whether jurors were even turning up. And people bang on about this, like they deliberated for 100 hours. Well, there's 22 charges. When you put someone up against a barrage of that many charges, and then what, 9, 10 months later, tell the jury to go out and work it out now. I mean, that's only just over 4 hours per charge, and a significant amount of time before that. Judge Goss had recalled them and said, I'll take majority verdicts on this, which obviously is his right to do so, but my God, it looks like he had it in for her from the very start. I really hope that Lucy Letby is released very soon anyway and fully exonerated, but I also particularly hope that he is still alive and can feel the full brunt of public and professional scorn, because he deserves it. Having had a brief look online about Judge Goss, the only remarkable things I've noticed is there is a blog called Bent Judge James Goss and a Twitter account of the same name run by a bloke who, I think it was 96 his case was heard, so he's been campaigning for a very long time. He says he encountered corruption which was entirely overseen by Goss, and also that Judge Goss several years ago excused jury after claims of jury tampering. He just dismissed a lot of them and decided that he himself was best placed to judge the veracity of the evidence. But that's about it. Anyway, I'm really curious as to whether judges generally fear or embrace the idea of running a big trial like this. Is this something that he was excited to get his hands on? Had he already decided that she was guilty? I think he had. I mean, Letby had been on the receiving end of years of mental treatment by that stage, including the massively melodramatic digging up of her garden, and I can see not one possible justification for that. It doesn't seem to fit with any of the accusations against her whatsoever. Because this search, it extended to drains, the gutters, her window ledges, and the neighbour's garage roof. I mean, that's fucking nuts. I've got to wonder whether this is some kind of coded language and it helps ramp up the press interest. Or, and I think this is probably more critical, invoke memories of Cromwell Street and Rose West. But of course, unlike Myra Hindley or Rose West, she wasn't involved in a folie à deux with a man who was either older than her or with whom she was infatuated. And her supposed murders didn't involve any sexual deviance or financial motive. She wasn't determined to oust the reminder of a loved one's ex. She wasn't at the end of her tether with postnatal depression or psychosis. She doesn't fit any of the previous molds. And I think this was kind of lazy scaremongering, which effectively, whether by design or not, signalled to the press that they were really going to go to town on this one. It also, Paul Hughes, the senior investigating officer, said, we wanted to leave no stone unturned, and it's kind of making a big song and dance about doing your job, but clearly you could really aggressively interrogate all sorts of areas and it's still not going to magic up evidence of a crime that never occurred. And of course we know their relationship with the media is highly suspiciously cosy, and they were certainly serving each other. And I suppose the press needs some little tidbits to keep them going in the multiple years between digging up the garden and getting this woman into court. This is the thing with tunnel vision. You could do a fingertip search of every haystack and still not see what is staring back at you and what is not staring back at you. Perhaps it is difficult to see that when you are Mr. Potato Head with stick-on eyes that can be moved if you want to, but probably, to be honest, most kids won't bother after doing it once. And I did wonder, actually, if my daughter's science demonstration could involve him and see if he could run an LED, but I'm unsure whether he has the powers to conduct that. Now, one of the things that has been regarded by other legal professionals as extremely unusual is that Judge Goss has given Lucy Letby a whole life order for each and every offence. Now, not only is she only the fourth woman ever to receive a whole life order, she's only the second person to receive one for a non-homicidal offence, and she's the first ever to be given multiple. And let's remember, she received 14 in one single sentencing, and then another less than a year later. As I've already said, there are many reasons to suspect that he went into this really wanting to be as draconian and unflinchingly punishing as possible. Now, I kind of feel like I should say Lucy Letby Analysis, A Liberated Mind and Stuart Gillam are going to be far better at analysing anything that Judge Goss has done and said or allowed or ruled inadmissible. I am not the go-to source here. I do think, though, overall, despite great work by them, Judge Goss's behaviour has been really overlooked, and maybe that is why he was grateful to have such a massive fucking clown as Dowie Evans to take up the heat. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a look where Judge Goss has left off in the sentencing, because it seems like it was quite peculiar and possibly controversial, although legal types are always extremely deferential when talking about colleagues or especially judges. Yeah, I think he was very mindful of his legacy. And so, reading this, a whole life order in each and every offence, the unprecedented implication of Lucy Letby's whole life orders, by Fee Robinson, writing in Barrister magazine. And she writes, saying, it is no surprise that she was given a whole life order, and that in receiving a whole life order, she is only the fourth woman in English legal history to receive one. And two, given the wording of the sentencing remarks, seemingly the first person to have received multiple whole life orders. And she talks about Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020, and setting where the circumstances where a whole life order can be imposed are set out. As I say, she says that it is apparently from the first time in English legal history, but that anyone has received multiple whole life orders. But also, she says, quote, it is even more notable that this wording appears to imply that Judge Goss passed whole life orders on single counts of attempted murder. This article aims to explore some of the questions raised by this single sentence contained in 10 pages of sentencing remarks. Firstly, can a whole life order be justified for each individual murder? Secondly, can a whole life order be justified for each individual attempted murder? And thirdly, how should we feel, given its principles, about multiple whole life orders? I'm skipping on a bit, but quoting again. Schedule 21, I'm guessing Section 4 of the Sentencing Act 2020, formerly the Sentencing Act 2003, sets out the circumstances in which a whole life order would be an appropriate starting point. It is not a closed list, but rarely has been departed from, though it appears the Court of Appeal does not favour judge-made new criteria, preferring judges to make whole life orders in novel circumstances on the basis of a lower starting point that, as a result of aggravating features, is pushed up to a whole life order. The question as to whether Goss J can justify a whole life order for each murder may well be an easier one to answer if these same crimes were committed today. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 made it law that the starting point for a premeditated murder of a child must be a whole life order. But clearly that's why it doesn't apply, because even if she had done these crimes, they would have been committed several years before. Quote, the next provision of relevance may be that the murder of a child that involves abduction or has sadistic or sexual motivation attracts a whole life order starting point. But Letby's murders weren't sadistic, and Judge Goss made this point in his sentencing remarks, describing her actions as only bordering on sadism. End quote. Yes, this is quite upsetting to hear. Even if these crimes have been committed, that they are just bordering on sadism, but this is about the law. This, quote, this appears to exhaust the options that would lead to a whole life order starting point for each individual murder. The next step would be explore the criteria for a 30-year starting point, the band below, and assume that the aggravating features of the young age of her victims and her abusive position aggravated the offence upwards to a whole life order. However, no criteria under this provision aids Goss J's sentencing either, with none of them mentioning murders of children or abusive position. End quote. This is curious about sentencing remarks. I remember this with Nicholas van Hoogstraten when he was finally released because of his loophole lawyer got him out, because in the sentencing remarks of the murder he had solicited, the judge made a minor slip up on the language he used in the summing up, and he got out scot-free. Quoting again, the only other justification would be one of truly novel statutory interpretation. Another variety of murder that would attract a whole life order starting point occurs where there is the murder of two or more persons where each murder involves, inter alia, premeditation. Letby's offending fulfills this criteria. She committed 7 murders and each, per Goss J, was premeditated. This certainly justifies a whole life order. But does it justify 7? Well, if one were to take the view that the impact of this provision is to enable a whole life order for each murder, where that murder is part of a series of 2 or more murders, then yes. However, this would be, as indicated, truly novel. Stephen John Port, the grinder killer who murdered 4 men and also committed a series of sexual assaults, received just 1 whole life order. Even more recently, Damien Bendel, responsible for the murder of a pregnant mother, her 2 children and another child, also received just 1 whole life order. Despite these offenders also fulfilling the same criteria as Letby, the position of judges has clearly been to interpret the provision as enabling a single whole life order for multiple murderers, rather than enabling multiple murderers to receive a whole life order for each of their murders. There is also the possibility that Goss J may contend that this is a new category of offence that should fall under Section 21. The issue with such is that the Court of Appeal held in an appeal by Wayne Couzens, of all people, that it was not for judges to make a new category. Rather, they must begin with a lower starting point and use aggravating features to conclude that the whole life order is justified. However, if this has been the approach of Goss J, the process he followed to arrive at a whole life order for each of the 7 murders is not laid out in his sentencing remarks. It therefore seems difficult to conclude that this is either the approach used to arrive at 7 whole life orders. Fee Robinson goes on and explains, this article is not attempting to suggest that Lucy Letby would succeed on appeal at reducing the time she will spend in prison. She quite clearly fulfills the final criteria discussed. End quote. And she goes on like this for a little while, talking about how somebody, McCann, was convicted of 37 offences, a number of which were sexual offences against children committed during a 2-week campaign. Sinagala, meanwhile, was convicted of 136 counts of rape and 16 further offences. Despite this magnitude of offending, the Court of Appeal held that the whole life orders could only be made in relation to discretionary life sentences when there were wholly exceptional circumstances. So she goes on and talks it all through. It doesn't seem that there is any justification for Goss's barrage, his flotilla of whole life orders. And following her conclusion with that, she goes on about how the value of a human life is not reflected in the sentence. That not only is the justice system not about retribution, which is, I don't know, I thought that was debatable, but this is not sustainable. And for the victims of Damien Bendel, who, let's remember, he murdered one pregnant woman and 3 children. He just got one. So are they, by virtue of this sentencing of Lucy Letby, are they to infer from that their loss is not as great? So essentially the point of this was to highlight just how draconian and censorious Judge Goss was, how he removed all sorts of things that could have stood in Lucy Letby's favour, included a bunch of really trivial shit that looked bad without any guidance from psychologists or statisticians, or just showed absolute hostility towards the defence the whole way through. And then when it comes to the sentencing, he fucking hammered her. He drowned her in 14 counts of "you have no hope." I think it's quite telling. Anyway, I will speak to you all later. Thank you very much. Bye bye.